Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show where we talk about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about Nancy Drew Season 4, Episode 5. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. I've never known that the crew was known as the Drew Crew, which I never knew that until I saw it in the description of this episode on the CW app. I don't know if like other places have like that same description for the episode. Maybe they do. 4 seasons, and I've never noticed that they're called the Drew Crew. I just never knew that. I was like, oh, I feel so stupid. It's not until the final season that I end up finding out about that. That's so wild to me. Either way, tangents and all that stuff, but not really a tangent. They are investigating, trying to figure out, okay, so this whole thing with the ooze in the water and unlocking all these buried secrets that have some supernatural force behind them that covered it up, but now it's also uncovering them for whatever reason. What this has to do with those very specific 8 bodies. They identified the 8 bodies, but the thing is, there's nothing beyond like, okay, we all know they all were born in Horseshoe Bay and they all died before they were 30. But other than that, not even how they died is clear, which ties into the overarching episode because at the crime scene where they last saw the bodies, Bess accidentally steps on one of the teeth. I thought like when she stepped in that mud or whatever, and I was like, oh, is that going to turn out to be some of the goo or something? But it's like, no, it all went into the water. So I thought that was going to be significant. And then just like, oh, she stepped on the tooth, which has some engravings on it. And then we find out from the coroner at the morgue, that Ace's boss, that, hey, there's other markings too on some of the other teeth. It's specifically 3 teeth from every mouth has these markings. But I also love him being like, yeah, but I'm also not going to do that much work because if doing all this extra stuff would be work. And Ace is like, yep, I have this as a perfect example of what to do. And I also love when he was about to leave, he's like, when I leave, you're going to steal this bag of teeth, aren't you? And then Nancy just kind of shrugs her shoulder like, and George is kind of looking like, maybe. And it's like, okay, just get it back here by 9 or Ace is going to lose his job. And it's like, geez, come on, really? Why am I going to be the one to suffer the ramifications? But it's like, I'm going to let you do your thing because obviously, Sheriff Lovett, or is it Chief Lovett? She recognizes the supernatural is here. Why she's adamant about things the way she is about the supernatural, especially when it comes to Bess. Like, it's like, once again, you witnessed the supernatural yourself. You're even acknowledging the supernatural exists, but you're like, yeah, keep it in the historical society. I'm like, there's something there. And maybe we'll find out that Lovett has something that's kind of buried that will eventually come about. But like I said, I don't think she's from Horseshoe Bay. Not unless it's a thing of, hey, you were born in Horseshoe Bay and just something drew you back. Like, Horseshoe Bay does seem to be a beacon of sorts. But circling back to the teeth situation, what makes them interesting, though, is that these marks, that the symbols weren't carved into the teeth. They're actually formed, they grew into the teeth, which is weird and why that is a thing. So it's about figuring that out, bringing in a dental expert that won't ask questions. And it makes sense, this being the final season, that George would interact with her father, kind of close out a lot of these storylines that have kind of been left open. So I really think it's actually kind of a beautiful element to this episode. It's actually kind of, obviously Nancy knows the complicated situation of, an estranged father and all of that. I mean, granted, like, obviously Nancy ended up stumbling across so many truths about herself in season 1/season 2 and continues to discover so much. But obviously it's like she knows what it is to have that complicated, biological father situation and that kind of like coming up in your life. And so for Edwin, he saw this as an opportunity, especially where him and George left things off. Because George is like, right, considering I told him off the last time I saw him, he's not going to show up. But he saw this as an opportunity, like, oh, I could work. Yeah, I'm going to do this for her. So he ended up referring to this room at this university that has all this hidden artifact, this historical artifacts that are kind of dangerous. Which I was like, which is so interesting that you're like, right, there's a very specific room for it, but you would think the historical society would have something. But I guess like they don't have they have maybe supernatural connections, but maybe they're not actively dangerous like all the stuff that's in the historical society is. So maybe that's why you would think there would be some crossover in that capacity. But I guess it's like, right, those are artifacts and they're dangerous, but maybe they're not, maybe they're not active stuff. Maybe they're kind of inert on their own right, or maybe it's nothing there that's, like I said, actively dangerous like stuff at the historical society is. I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing that it's like, right, why wouldn't some of this stuff be at the historical society? But yeah, maybe they just don't have the rights to have all that stuff. But Edwin got them into the place, and obviously it's an interesting time because George is trying to pre-register for college and stuff, but she can't because she obviously doesn't have the money to really cover like pre-registrations, but even the late fees are too much as well. So going against her wishes, Bess throws like the first ever like singles night in Horseshoe Bay to try and raise money for her, which George was immediately like, no. And even Nancy being like, oh, you should actually throw the party in the woods because the moment George finds out about you doing this, she's going to be extremely angry and you're going to need a place to run away. You're going to need wide open space so you have enough room to run away. So, but because Edwin was, in college himself when he ended up having George, which he even admits, like, right, despite me not being in your life, I did think about you when I was in college. And the sad thing is, it does mean something to George. Even when George is kind of pushing him away, you could tell her being like, what he said she does kind of resonate with it a little bit. Like, it was kind of nice hearing that, despite like, right, you weren't in my life, you are making an attempt now, but it's like, is it too little too late? And I think that's Edwin's fear. But even he's like, even saying later, it's like, even if you don't want me in your life, I'm still going to do everything to make you a part of my life. And I was like, I thought that was really sweet, especially when you use that metaphor of like, right, I know you don't need anyone's help climbing the mountain, but it's not a bad thing to kind of ask someone to hold, like, hold the backpack for you, like, to lighten your load, to ease your burden, which even Bess had calls George out for it later on, because it's like, right, you're not the best at asking for help, which, that's kind of a commonality between her and Nancy. Like, Nancy for a long time would just do so much on her own because she had a hard time relying on people. So, George has had to always rely only on herself, take care of herself and her sister. So she had to, once again, grow up real fast. So I think having Edwin here kind of like resurges a lot of that need to be like, no, I've always been independent, so it's hard to fully rely on another person. She slowly opened up more and more as the show is going on, but it's still that, I'm sure that she still associates like, right, you weren't in my life when I could have used you and needed you, because she had to step up and be like a parent. She had to grow up so much faster. Like, she had to be the support system for her family and didn't really have the support system in herself, Her sisters tried, but like, once again, they're being supported as kids, so there's only so much they could do. Like, there was no one in George's life to really support her in that capacity. So I think all those complicated feelings kind of emerged there. So when it's all said and done, I continue on the George story route. I think it is when they go to the singles night. Well, first and foremost, him willing to help out at the when they end up discovering like, hey, there's a device that can tell us how these people died, like the skulls, because it turns out the skulls they found in Horseshoe Bay aren't the only ones. There are skulls in that that secret dangerous room that are from 500 plus years ago, but these people died in Wales. So it's like, right. So they don't even have a direct correlation to Horseshoe Bay. So maybe it is something that came from Europe initially that came over to Horseshoe Bay. Maybe this is like early days of Horseshoe Bay, like maybe when this country was quote unquote discovered, like maybe like when the 13 colonies were initially being built out and stuff like that. Maybe like Horseshoe Bay's early days like connects to like travelers, people from Wales. So maybe that's the correlation. Maybe that's the connection. It doesn't seem like, I was about to say like, not unless it's a familial thing, but I'm like, doesn't seem like there's any connection. Once again, no connective thread that we're aware of at this time, and the Drew crew is aware of at this time about the connection between these 8 dead individuals. So maybe there's some, like said, like some family lineage thing that connects them to the 3 skulls. Like maybe it's a thing of there's like 8 particular families that are originally from Wales that transferred over here to Horseshoe Bay, and these are their respective, I don't know. There's some correlation there. We're just not, we're still missing pieces to the puzzle. But either way, I went on that whole tangent, but Edwin wanted to be the guy of like, right, we are going to be needing to deal with a relics hunter and dealer that we've kind of like don't want to get too deep in that world, considering it's like, well, Mr. Bobbsey, Ace has kind of been around him, and so that kind of Ace doesn't want to stick his neck out in that world, and obviously because of Nancy's connections and run-ins with the glasses, she can't stick her neck out too much, so they needed a third party, and that ended up being Edwin. I thought it was an interesting discovery when it's like, oh, the person he's meeting with, at first I was like, is that Ryan? It turns out to be him, because he did give Nancy money for the property tax, and it's like, oh, what he's doing for work must be really working out. It's like, oh, he's been covering what he's really been up to, because it turns out he's kind of an artifact hunter or retriever, and he's actually really good at it. He's like, he initially started doing this to get back all the ones that the glasses has stole, it's because he wanted to get back at them, but he actually found out like, oh, like, you've always known that you were good at this detective thing ever since you were a kid. To me, this is the first time in my life I feel good about, like, oh, I'm actually good at something. And he showcases it later that he actually is. He's like, oh, I could actually do a lot of good with this. So he ended up kind of helping point Nancy in the right direction for the device that they're looking for this episode that can help figure out, oh, how these skulls died. Because whatever killed those skulls from Wales 500 years ago might have had something to do with the 8 that died here in Horseshoe Bay. So, and I do like to connect the thread where even Edwin was like, oh, that's Nancy's dad. Oh, he must have been like 18 when he had her. And it's like, right, there's common ground. Which is like, and even George being snidely like, oh, like, why don't you start a club or something like that? It's like, yeah. Which obviously we're not even getting to the complicated thing of like, yeah, we're kind of brushing that history under the rug. But, it's like, well, your daughter did have an affair with Nancy's biological dad before all that information was out there, but still, that is kind of awkward. Like, she's a lot more, like, her and Ryan are in a much better place. It's still just kind of like that awkward thing to think about from time to time that happened. But staying on Edwin and George, him helping out at the single nights as like a bartender and George helping out too. I really appreciated him stopping by and even was like, all right, because he was going to offer her money because she got a lot for her tuition for at least like 1 or 2 semesters, but Edwin wanted to give her like a $30,000 check, which, once again, she has a hard time accepting that. But he's like, right, you can kind of do what you want with it, but just know, like, I do want to help. This isn't me trying to make reprimands for all the, the time I've missed and, not being in your life. It's just, I believe in you and I want to help you because, and just that moment they have. It was just a beautiful moment that they shared, and I thought that was kind of nice. And she's saying, like, right, I need to get my teeth checked, like once a year or whatever, so I'll stop by then. He's like, well, teeth cleanings are twice a year. She's like, fine, whatever, But it's like, that's kind of nice that bridge is being gapped at least a little bit. So, like I said, I like that we are getting that in this final season, kind of closing that for George at the very least. I think that's an important thing for her. Especially as she's kind of entering this next stage of her life and figuring things out, especially on the law front. So, and, going to college and stuff. So there's that. Then there's also, switching gears a little bit about complications, there's the whole Ace and Nancy of it all, which I think it's interesting. Obviously, Ace didn't go to the singles night, but Nancy did because Bess kind of forced her hand in that regard. I was like, isn't it a little too soon to be pushing her out there? But it's like, right, considering yours and Ace's circumstances isn't clearing up anytime soon, and it might not ever clear up, you deserve to kind of put yourself back out there because it's easier. I think it's also Bess's way to try and, Bess is very forceful in her manners in which she like forces help upon people, but I think it is necessary in the long run. Sadly, Nancy spent the entire speed dating thing like complaining about like, the love circumstances. She's like, isn't that right, Craig? He's like, my name's Marcus. As you can see, it's written here. She's like, oh, okay, right. Sorry about that. But it's just she was basically talking about the breakup and everything and, how, and it's like, complaining to each one of her dates about it and just kind of it sucked. It's still a fresh wound and it's just not going to go away, when you found that true love, that spark, it's hard to kind of pretend like nothing went away when it's like, oh, no, the kiss that like changed everything. It's like that kiss was like the best kiss ever. Like, how do you just kind of forget about that? Because they're trying to start over her and Ace of like, right, he's like, oh, so are we just going to be like companions, like just people working together? She's like, I need a starting point because they haven't really talked. They've been awkward around each other this entire episode. So she delivers the teeth back to Ace so he gets to keep his job. And they finally had their conversation because for her, it's like, you gave up. because he's like, I'm trying to figure out what we're going to do going forward. And she's like, well, you're the one that kind of gave up, you know, but he's like, but what do you think love is? Like, we're supposed to like die for each other. He's like, no, love is kind of, you know, and I think that's a beautiful thing of what is love. Love is finding, you know, isn't finding someone to die for. It's finding someone to live for. And in Ace's case, I was like, I want us both to live. And it's like, love is despite not being able to be with the person you care about most in the world, wanting them to be happy, no matter how much it's tearing me up on the inside, that you deserve to be with someone that's going to make you happy, that's going to be that person that loves you the way you deserve to be, you know? And it kind of reminds me of a lot of spoilers. Yes, kind of. I was about to say, it kind of reminds me of Lyra and Will's circumstances from his Dark Materials. So, and it's kind of sad, and it's just kind of like, right, we, you know, eventually, like, hopefully we both can get to that point where we can, because it's like, right, we, at the end of the day, it sucks, but we both want that for each other. We want, each one of them deserves to be happy, and they want the other one to be happy, despite how heartbreaking it is that they themselves can't be together, you know? It's like, right, you find someone, a great love, and it's like, well, after you, I can't, you know, I won't accept anything less than like a great love after having, you know, after our situation. And, you know, same thing's applicable for Nancy. So, oh, it's beautiful. Speaking of his Dark Materials, that device they use when it opens up at the end of the episode and it's kind of like a compass, I was immediately like, oh, that gives me a lithiometer vibes, you know? So I wonder, does it have like, I mean, it's a compass pointing you in the right direction, but they can't read any of the symbols on it. So I am curious, like, will it be something that can be, I mean, I'm sure it's not decipherable like the lithiometer is. Obviously, it's not going to be that complex, but I'm sure it's going to be a circumstance of like, those symbols do mean something in some regard. So it does point them in the right direction, but we'll get to that later. But circling back to the device a little bit, there's two things. One, like the fact is when it opened up and sprayed out dust, I was like, are we not concerned about that? With all these supernatural devices and connected stuff, I'd be scared about inhaling any dust. But it seemed like that was just dust. But like the fact is it was Nancy, George, and Bess. Not unless that ends up being something that happens later on, but them specifically, they're the ones who breathed it in. So I'm like, okay, maybe it was just dust, but I'm just worried. I'm curious to see if that ends up being something to go like, oh, actually that was something. It just didn't kick in until now. We'll see. But the second thing is the person who Ryan got the device from, and he met with the person, and it turns out she has had a run-in with the glasses as well. It's like, right, we've both been kind of screwed over by them, so it's like, hey, let's work together and take them down a peg or two, or six, which is interesting. At first I was like, oh, like, I was like, they have the enemy of my enemy is my friend, which is like, okay, so Ryan's got some allies to kind of, so I guess a big part of his story is going to be going toe to toe with the glasses this season, and what kind of transpires from that, which is going to be interesting considering, like, right, Ryan might be gunning for the glasses and maybe their son and Nancy, because they were setting that up like that might be a thing, and that might be a thing, and that might come in conflict with Ryan's beef with the glasses, and which Nancy kind of has beef with them as well, so that's probably going to complicate things if they go down that route. Like I said, it felt like they were setting that up, but I was like, how are you going to set that up when there's obviously a Ace and Nancy thing despite their current circumstances? But where they are currently, and especially the whole being happy with someone else, it's going to be complicated, it's going to be hard. But I'm like, man, I'm wondering, it seemed like the couplings are not going to be what it's not going to be like hey, George and Nick, even though you're like, man, I wish that did work out. But I mean, it's like, that's not always the case. The pairings don't always pan out like that. I'm even talking about that with Riverdale, where I'm like, some of these pairings, I'm like, are they going to, because they set up certain pairings like last season that I'm like, are those going to be the pairings by the end of the show? And I'm not sure. Like the Archie of it all, it's like, that was going to flip-flop so much. It's always been a thing in a comic, so I don't know if there's like going to be a solidified answer by the end of the series. You'd assume there would be, but I'm curious what it's going to be. But like the back and forth in that regard of like, Betty and Veronica, but other couplings, I'm like, oh, is that going to end up being a thing? Or, so I'm curious. In this capacity, it seems like there's not going to be a Nick and George, not unless they do find their way back to each other. He's currently dating Jade, so I don't know what's going to happen on that front. But also like an Ace and Nancy may never get back together. Who knows? Got quite a few episodes left in the show. 8 episodes, I believe, off the top of my head, and left in the show. So still plenty of room and time for other stuff to happen. So we'll have to wait and see on that front. Speaking of Nick, working with Ace and Bess, they end up trying to get the water supply kind of shut down, which they eventually kind of like, I think they like put it in containers or whatever while they were like replacing the water. I think it was kind of, it's like, right, no one's drinking it anymore. It's not completely like drained, but it's being stored somewhere to, I guess they could figure it all out. Because initially Ace's plan was to basically create like an Egyptian, Ting plague situation of, well, I thought they were going to go the whole rigmarole of like all 10 phases, but it's like, no, just turning the water red, but with a spell from Bess. They ended up making the water red enough so that they had no choice but to, I love all those people complaining like, oh, my child has to bathe in this water. Wait, why are you turning away? Why are you walking away? I love that, was it Officer, oh God, what was it? Lovejoy, I believe, or something? Where she was turning and looking to one of the other cops and he's praying and she's just like, she immediately knows Nick is behind this, but she's like, fine, we're shutting down the water, we're getting a supply from someone else, and I had to deal with them and that was annoying, so I'm going to be keeping my eye on you, Nick. So it's like, yeah, the timing's a little too interesting, so it's like, yeah, of course they're going to keep an eye. So it's like, right, we got rid of the water supply for now, so it shouldn't be as much of an issue, but, when it rains it pours, so I'm sure there's going to be some complications. So how that turns out is definitely going to be interesting in the long run. Bess talked about it this episode about her kind of fighting a little bit more against Lovitz for the whole secret historical society situation. So we'll see how that battle kind of goes for her going forward. Kind of staying her ground on that principle in those circumstances, fighting for the historical society and stuff. So there's that. And then finally our group gets pointed in a direction by the compass and find out the one behind all of this is a monster, which is it like the one directly behind all of this, or is it a means by someone else's hand? Is it just kind of like, is it the cause of everything, but someone's controlling it or behind it? Typically ends up being the case. Not unless this thing is its own thing, but like, where did it come from? Why is it connected to all of this? If it is the one doing all this, why? So many questions, and I'm so curious to see where all of this ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I wanted to talk about. So the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.